You keep trying to fit me in your frame, cut my corners, change my name.
It's January. Gyms are busier, trackers are buzzing, people are starting over with new plans and new goals. At the same time, a national report on physical activity in Canadian adults came out at the end of 2025. It pulls together data from large surveys and monitoring programs and gives the country a kind of report card on how much we actually move. A few numbers stand out. Only about 46% of adults meet the basic guideline of 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity per week. Only about 32% get enough daily steps to be considered even moderately active. Those numbers have been low and basically flat for years. So there's a gap here. On one side, we have guidelines, campaigns, workplace wellness, and every possible kind of fitness content. On the other, almost half of adults are still not reaching the minimum for health, and their daily movement is not increasing in any meaningful way. Most people already know that moving matters. You don't need to read a 70-page document to know that sitting all day, every day, isn't going to end well. You can feel that in your own body, and just leave it to me to read the report. It's long, it's kind of boring, and it just actually made me really mad. The more interesting question is different. If we are surrounded by information and reminders, why are our actual behaviors so stagnant? Why are so few people curious enough to look at their own day and ask, what is really going on here? Why do I live this way? And what would have to change for this to look different? In this episode, the focus is not on another list of things you should do. It's on that gap between knowing and doing, the lack of curiosity about our own choices, and what it means when stagnation stops being a circumstance and becomes a decision. To make sense of this, it helps to know what this report is and what it is not. It's a national snapshot. Researchers pulled data from large Canadian surveys and monitoring systems and graded adults on several movement-related areas. Things like weekly activity minutes, daily steps, strength training, sleep, and how much time we spend sitting. On paper, the guidelines are straightforward. Adults are advised to get at least 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous activity, spread over the week, plus muscle strengthening work at least twice. There are also recommendations around limiting sedentary time, keeping recreational screen time in check, and aiming for 7 to 9 hours of sleep. When you look at what people are actually doing, the pattern is clear. As mentioned earlier, only about 46% of adults hit that 150-minute threshold. Only about 32% reach roughly 7,500 steps a day, which is a common cutoff for what would be considered a generally active lifestyle. Strength training is similar. Only a minority of adults are doing muscle strengthening activities twice per week or more. The report also links this stagnation to real consequences. Physical inactivity is estimated to cost Canada billions of dollars each year in avoidable healthcare spending and lost productivity. At the same time, Even modest improvements in population activity levels are tied to large potential savings and better mental and physical health outcomes. So the picture is not subtle. We have clear recommendations. We have consistent data showing that a large portion of adults are nowhere near them, and those gaps are not closing over time in any meaningful way. When you read through how the report talks about solutions, you see a familiar pattern. The ideas are not new. They are versions of the same approaches we have seen for years. The document points to things like improving walkability, adding bike lanes, encouraging active commuting, workplace wellness programs, and more physical activity counseling in healthcare. It talks about employers offering gym subsidies, standing desks, or time off to be active, and municipalities investing in facilities and recreation programs. On paper, none of that sounds harmful. The problem is that it is all very high level and very repetitive. These strategies live at the level of policy documents and town plans, not at the level of a real person's Tuesday night when they are tired, behind on everything, and trying to get their kids to bed. The report also emphasizes more coordination, more frameworks, and more long-term investment. Again, these are the same categories of solutions that have been discussed for a very long time. During that time, the actual behavior data has stayed almost flat. So there is a mismatch. On one side, a system that keeps cycling through the same types of strategies. On the other, a population whose daily routines and choices are barely shifting. At some point, repeating the same ideas stops looking like strategy and starts looking like a lack of imagination. When you strip away the jargon, the basic idea behind most behavior models is pretty simple. To do something consistently, three things have to be true. You have to be able to do it in some form. Your life has to make some room for it, and you have to care enough to choose it over competing options. For many adults in Canada, that bar is already met, at least in part. Most people have some physical ability to move, even if that doesn't look like gym workouts or long runs. Most people have at least small pockets of time and some kind of space where movement could happen, even if it is not ideal. And almost everyone can explain in basic terms why being active is better than being inactive. That does not erase real constraints. Chronic pain, disability, shift work, caring responsibilities, money, and energy all change what is realistic. They narrow the options and they change the shape of enough. But within those limits, there is almost always a range between doing nothing and doing something. This is where the language of stagnation matters. If you know movement is important, if you can do something within your own limits, and if your day contains at least a little room that could be used differently, then staying completely still is not just something that happens to you. It is a decision, even if it is a quiet one made by default. The report shows a country where half of adults do not reach even the minimum recommended amount of movement, and that has been true for years. At some point, that pattern stops becoming only about systems and starts being about what people are or are not willing to decide inside the lives they actually have. If we stop the story at people should decide to move more, it is still incomplete. Most adults are not sitting around planning to avoid movement. They are reacting to whatever their day throws at them. Work, kids, commutes, screens, fatigue. One thing rolls into the next. What is often missing is not information, but curiosity. Very few people actually sit down and look at their own week with any real interest. They do not ask, where does my time really go? When do I have energy? When do I always crash? What do I reach for when I feel stressed or tired? Instead, they accept their days as fixed and then say there is no time or no way to move. The report gives us national numbers on movement and inactivity. It doesn't and can't answer those personal questions. It cannot tell you why you always skip the walk after work or why your phone wins every time you sit on the couch. That level of detail requires curiosity about your own patterns, not another guideline. Curiosity is uncomfortable because it exposes trade-offs. If you honestly map your day, you might see that you spend more time scrolling than you thought, or that certain habits are non-negotiable even though they don't serve you. You might realize that movement would be possible if something else gave way. That is not an easy realization, but it is the only place real change starts. So when we talk about stagnation, it is not just about low step counts or minutes on a chart. It is also about how willing we are to ask better questions about how we live, why our days look the way they do, and what we are actually prepared to change. At this point, it might sound like the obvious next move is to offer solutions. A list of habits, a set of routines, a handful of simple tricks to move more. That is exactly what most health content does, and it is part of why so little changes. Generic advice rarely survives contact with a real life. A list of do this, not that ideas cannot account for chronic pain, shift work, 3 kids, or the fact that you were mentally drained before dinner most nights. When those tips don't fit, people usually don't rewrite the advice. They decide that nothing works for them and move on. The content gets discarded and the pattern repeats with the next thing. This is one reason the gap stays open between national recommendations and actual behavior. We keep layering information and instructions on top of lives we have never really examined. We treat movement like something that can be fixed with a better plan or a better program, instead of something that has to be built around individual constraints, preferences, and trade-offs. No national report can do that for you. Its job is to show the broad pattern, not to custom fit your day. So in this episode, the goal is different. Not to hand you another set of steps to follow, but to name why so many of those steps fail. Without curiosity about your own reality and honest decisions about what you are willing to change, even the best designed template will end up in the same place as all of the others. Briefly exciting, then forgotten, with your behavior right back where it started. When you put all of this together, the picture is not flattering, but it is clear. We have national guidelines that spell out the basics of movement. We have a detailed report showing that only about half of adults meet those basics, and that this has barely shifted over time. We also live in a culture saturated with health information and fitness content. At the same time, most of us rarely pause to look at our own lives with any real curiosity. We say there is no time, no energy, no options, often without ever mapping a week, questioning how we use our attention, or noticing the small decisions that keep movement off the table. It is more comfortable to point to systems or to wait for the next program than to sit with what we could change and simply don't. None of this denies that circumstances can be hard. Pain, disability, stress, money, and responsibility all shape what is realistic. They narrow what active can look like. But inside those limits, there is almost always a spectrum from nothing to something, and staying at the very bottom of that spectrum is not an accident forever. Over years, it becomes a decision. This report gives the national side of that story. The personal side is quieter and less measurable. It shows up in whether we stay on autopilot or start asking better questions, in whether we are willing to be curious about our own routines and honest about the trade-offs we are choosing. No document, no policy, and no January reset can do that part for us. That piece is ours. So where does that leave us? This report card is not going to change anyone's life on its own. Most people will never read it, and even if they did, it wouldn't tell them what to do with their Wednesday night. What it does show very clearly is the gap between what we say we value and how we actually live is not closing. Closing that gap does not start with another program or another slogan or another medication. It starts with a quieter move, becoming genuinely curious about your own patterns instead of assuming they are fixed. Looking at how you spend your days, what you reach for when you are tired, what you protect, and what you are willing to let go of. Stagnation is not just low movement on a chart. It is living the same week on repeat without ever asking why. Once you start asking those questions, movement stops being an abstract recommendation and becomes part of a larger choice. Am I willing to keep living on autopilot or not? That is the space this show lives in, not quick fixes, not performative resolutions, but the uncomfortable, honest work of paying attention and deciding what to do with what you find. So if that resonates with you, take a moment to like this episode, watch some of the other ones that are here, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel. It all helps. And I will see you on the next one.